I'm Rick Dudarian, and you're listening to Realms of Memory. How do you reconcile the desire to be proud of your nation if its beginnings were colored by unspeakable crimes? How do you remember histories of deportation, dispossession, mass rape, and even genocide that accompanied the birth of many nations? This is the dilemma for Turkey. Born out of the ashes of the old multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire, today's Republic of Turkey was built on the unmixing and even the eradication of many of those very same minority populations. The Armenian Genocide is one of the more prominent examples of the dark side of the origins of modern Turkey. Eren Yetkin is a sociologist at Koblenz University in Germany and the author of Violence and Genocide in Kurdish Memory, exploring the remembrance of the Armenian Genocide through life stories. Eren's interest in the Armenian Genocide began in his late teens and early 20s, working in the region of Van.
When I was living in Turkey, I worked as a hiking guide, as a mountain guide for approximately 5 years, 2005 until 2010. So in this period of time, I worked a lot in the region of Van, and I discovered like towns, not towns, but villages with monasteries, Assyrian and Armenian monasteries, or ruins, or emptied, or plundered by the gravediggers after the genocide.
The city and province of Van were unique, not just in having the only Armenian majority population in the Ottoman Empire, but also as a center of Armenian political and intellectual life.
Maybe for the listeners about the region, like what we call today the Eastern Anatolia, it's a political term for the Turkish state. Yeah, what we call today the Eastern Anatolia, or what we call today North Kurdistan, the Bakur in Kurdish, was the West Armenia. Or it was called Armenian. Or it was a part of the Armenian High Plateau. So. That region had enormous Armenian population, not just with the census. I mean here, not just like how many million people lived there, belonging to the Armenian Christian Church, like the Gregorian, the Orthodox Church. This is not just what I mean, but also it was a place where the Armenian intellectual and political life arose. One of the Armenian political parties was founded in Van.
If I could put myself in the place of one of the participants in the tour, and I'm spending this money and I'm traveling and I'm in this region and you're my guide, and I ask a question, well, what's the history of this church? What happened to the community that it's supported? And this is the Eren before he's had the chance to really read the scholarship and literature, and he's really a product of that upbringing in Turkey, and he's got to react to that question. I'm just kind of curious, well, how might you have responded, at least during those early stages, and maybe you learn more later on, and that response might have changed?
Mm-hmm. No, I understand. It was like more or less like using some terminologies that were produced because you don't have the other tools to explain it. You didn't read or you didn't encounter other tools to explain it. And one of the tools is like using the terminology "tehcir," which means deportation, but without questioning what it really means. So it's a crime as well, deporting people or orchestrating deportations of the civilians. It's a crime. So if you use that terminology in such a setting, a tour or like a meeting and so on, so in Turkish it will mean not a crime because it was propagated. It's still propagated, by the way, tehcir. So, but genocide, the term genocide was not so well known for me, I guess, until 2006, I would say. So after 2006, I read more columns like produced or written by Hrant Dink, the Istanbul Armenian journalist who was assassinated, murdered by a right-wing youngster or a militia, let's say so, supported by the state structures. And I would argue it was one of the main moments for the people in Turkey to realize what was happening in the country.
What the Armenian journalist Eren Yetkin was challenging in the early 2000s was a long history of Turkish denialism of the Armenian Genocide. Eren explains that denialism goes back to the very beginning of the Turkish Republic.
Turkish denialism, like state denialism, was always there. From 1915 on until now, there was a kind of denialism with different aspects, or looking or focusing the lens on different aspects and so on. But the denialism, the notion of denialism, the aspect of denialism, that concept was always there. Even during the genocide, there were propaganda letters, the propaganda text about the Armenian uprisings and so on. The so-called Armenian uprisings. So the denialism was there, but after the genocide, like after 1918, in Turkey we had two governments, one in Istanbul, in Constantinople, and another in Ankara. So these trials, after 1918, they were conducted by the Istanbul government or by the Entente powers, by the foreign powers, like in Malta and so on, by the British power. It was not the case of the Ankara government, which was the winner of the war, let's say so. So because it's the predecessor of the Turkish Republic, the Ankara government. It was the political group that founded the Turkish Republic in the year 1923. So that was the context. So about denialism, I argue that denialism should be considered as a process, not as a category, because it changed. Like in the first Republican years, 1923 until 1950s, there was this denialism, if I may use the argument of Yektan Türkülmaz, another scholar in the field. That denialism was targeting the violence. It was the denial. It was denying the violence in those years, 1915 and 1918. So, because we didn't have the term genocide, it was first discussed in the year 1948 in the UN. Until 1948, genocide was not a juridical term. So this is also why Turkish state was denying the violence, not the genocide. So after 1965, so 50 years after the genocide, in the year 1965 first, maybe, in the year 1965, different groups of the different Armenian communities in diaspora, but also in Armenia, the Soviet Armenia, they were protesting. They went on the streets. So this was a moment where Turkey changed its course of denialism from violence to genocide, and Turkey also used the term of genocide. Not in the in means of like recognizing what happened, but denying what happened.
In the 1990s, Turkish denialism took on an even more aggressive form through the search for Armenian perpetrators and Turkish victims with the construction of the Zev Martyrdom Memorial Site outside of Van. This is a memorial, Eren explains, that not only denies the history of the Armenian genocide, but also the history and identity of the Kurdish community in the region.
So one of the examples what I wrote in my book is the Zev Martyrdom Memorial Site. Like it's a memorial site 25 kilometers away from the city center of Van, and built by the governorship of Van during a specific era where the enthusiastic search for mass graves of Muslims took place, who were allegedly murdered by the Armenian militias. And such activities of unearthing mass graves came to be an act of collecting evidence, in quotation marks, for Turkish victimhood thesis in the 1990s. And the memorial site has an obelisk in the mid and a rotunda, so to speak, a rondel with concrete blocks. The memorial site, and it is dedicated, according to the information board, to the, I quote here, 2,500 heroic Turkish sons who were murdered by the Armenian militias bloodthirstily in different village names in villages in May 1915. End of quote. So the text on the information board further includes aspects of the remapping and renaming issues, by the way, in Kurdistan, because the names of the villages are all Turkish, even though even though that memorial site was located in northern Kurdistan, and it redefined the Kurds it redefines the Kurds with Turkish sons, so to speak. And although the majority of, if not all of these villages were Kurdish or Armenian, in this very text, they carry Turkish names, and the Kurds became Turkish sons. So it was not just against the Armenian, let's say, claims, but it was also about the Kurdish identity politics.
Is it fair to recap then that you have maybe you have the genocide that happens and you have denialism that goes back to the very beginning, but you don't have to really address it until you get to the 60s because there's no label for it. Maybe you're just denying the violence that happened. And you mentioned also there are efforts to prevent Armenians from coming back, right? That there are laws that are passed so they can't actually return. There are a lot of people who do want to return. And then as things evolve over time, you have the labeling of it in the 1960s, and you have a more blatant form of denialism where you have examples like this Zev Memorial, where you're actually accusing Armenians of committing atrocities. And then you get to the 2000s, and it's this brief period of democratization in Turkey and a period of what seems like openness towards talking about violence in the Turkish past.
You use the term like democratization. I would say more liberalization, because it was not like the government was not trying to democratize the country. It was a liberalization of the country or some discourses. But if it was about like labor rights, if it was about the rights for certain groups,
freedom of the press, right?
Yeah, freedom of the press. So it was not democratization; it's more liberalization. So in the 2000s, we see different NGOs founded in the country looking into the past, or saying like, or arguing, we have to face the history of this country. One of the reasons of these movements were probably, or I would argue, well, in the 1990s, lots of academics went to other countries and came back to Turkey and worked in Turkey again, or they built their connections to Turkish academics. So they also, like in the 1990s and the 2000s, so there was this internationalization movement, so to speak, in Turkey. It was not just like what happened in Turkey, but I also look. There is something in the academic literature, and we need to reflect it. So some of the NGOs were founded in those years, 2000s. Some of the NGOs were already founded in the 1990s because of the repression against the Kurdish people, against Kurds. In 2000s, it was like after a period of violence, like the 90s. It was the moment to see, okay, what can we do in the country? So there was the repression still, but it was different. It was a bit more liberal, not democratic, but a bit more liberal, with more rooms, but not thanks to the government, thanks to the civil society. So civil society, journalists, academics, they created that space, but in the long run, after a long fight.
And here you have a more subtle reformulation of denialism, where you have official proclamations, official documents. You're labeling one in short, the Just Memory one, produced by the Ministry of Foreign, the foreign minister of Turkey at the time. That's similar to this exhibit that you've labeled as the pomegranate exhibit, where you're trying to recast. There's almost like a nostalgic recasting of the Ottoman past, and that was, from my understanding, from my interview with Eren Yetkin, there was during the 2000s a lot of nostalgia for the multicultural Ottoman past, right? So maybe that's a reflection of that you're trying to present this period as a golden era of coexistence, and communities got along. And what happened? Well, the rise of nationalism, right? And it's another way of turning the blame on the groups for their own victimization.
To start with, it is that other example, the concept of just memory. It was first presented by the former foreign minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who afterwards became the prime minister and is now the leader of an opposition party in Turkey. In an article published in an Istanbul-based policy journal, he presented his concept, that just memory. His concept is focused on a construction of the past, what we call actually the remembrance or memory, centered on an idealized coexistence, a romanticized coexistence, where people with different religious backgrounds, languages, rural or urban living experiences live together in peace, so to speak. And it's not true. In 2016, in April, for a brief time period, like 22 days, there was a short-term exhibition that was the materialization of this just memory concept. The exhibition was called Eren Yetkin. If I will translate like with the intention of pomegranate, like the pomegranate, the fruit is something something important for the Armenian culture, and on the other hand, it's a tool to romanticize the history. And the organizer was the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs of this exhibition. So the foreign minister was Davutoğlu, who wrote that article. And some months or years after, we had that exhibition. The narrative was not so blatant. Yes, it was organized, that exhibition, and that exhibition was organized in a sort of Belle Époque. I call it Belle Époque because Belle Époque also ended. It was not the beginning of a new story, but it was just a short period of time, and it also ended. And maybe an interesting point will be like the just memory concept, and also the exhibition Eren Yetkin. They also were homogenizing all the communities in West Armenia and in the Ottoman Empire, But we know from the historical studies that the Kurds in Istanbul were different than the Kurds, let's say, in Diyarbakir. Or the Armenians in Bitlis-Hizan were different than the Armenians in Izmir, in Smyrna. So it was not a homogeneous community. Neither the Armenian community nor the Kurdish communities. They were not homogeneous. But the narrative of the just memory tries to homogenize like the state, Ottoman Turks, Sunni Kurds, Sunni Turks, and the Armenians, like a binary, But it is not true. It was much more complicated, maybe not complicated, but much more complex. It was a complex structure, and that denialist narrative of just memory looked into this, not looking maybe, but produced that narrative, that discourse of coexistence. And for the coexistence, it used only two homogeneous groups, Because if you present the story as complex as it was, so you cannot work with a coexistence. In a complexity, you have different communities that were in fight or in discussion with each other. And that was the reality in the Ottoman Empire before the genocide.
So you have a kind of like a Turkish glasnost, maybe. It's fair to call it that happens maybe beginning in the 1990s. You mentioned that there are NGOs that are promoting the rights of different minorities that were subject to violence under military rule. That you get into the 2000s, and there's a willingness on the part of the government to loosen the reins on freedom of speech, the press. You have more Turkish scholars who are studying abroad, coming back home with an awareness of histories that maybe haven't been talked about in their own countries, in their own country. And then you have events, you mentioned too, that you have events like commemorations that take place, Taksim Square, and you have exhibitions that are organized. Could you talk about and this particular journalist who takes on the Armenian past in a direct way? So what are some of the examples of people really putting these histories out into the public sphere?
I particularly look into two exhibitions that were organized in Istanbul in the years 2015 and 2016 during my field research. One of them is Bizzat Hallediniz, Please Deal Personally. It was a short-term exhibition designed by the Istanbul-based NGO Babil and History Foundation of the country and launched in December 2015. It was concentrated on the years 1915 till 18 and the question of what happened to the Armenians through treating some telegrams, mostly sent by Talat Pasha, the orchestrator of the genocide, to the regional governors or state agents on the field. According to the exhibition team, they considered a sample of 5,000 telegrams filed in the Ottoman archives of the Prime Minister's State Archive, and reduced the corpus of this sample to 400 pieces to exhibit. The main material of the exhibition were these telegrams and their transliterations from Ottoman Turkish into contemporary Turkish, with the transliterations into the new alphabet. So the team cooperated closely with historians, and one of the main topics was the deportation politics, so that the exhibition hall was designed in the fashion of a deportation map. It was an original exhibition since the team disclosed new materials for the public, but that massive amount of telegrams reflected, so to speak, the massive organization of the genocide and planning of the extermination campaigns. Yet, for the exhibits, low-cost materials were low-cost materials were chosen, like normal printer papers, A4, what we use here in Europe, A4 papers, no facsimiles, hanged on the desk and walls. And the walls were fully occupied in a linear framing of telegram copies without comments, remarks, inspiring questions, or even explanations that had to give an irritating impression of being in an unorganized archive. So it was a kind of unorganized archive. So the only provided orientation consisted of the place names on the ground, like on the deportation map, and the brief biographies of the governors or state agents who signed and received telegrams sent by Talat Pasha, hanged on the pillars of the hall. So, if I may, like, visitors literally had to deal personally. In my interpretation, there was this issue of aesthetic impact, not just because of the material quality, but the exhibition had a very high-level historians, archivists, narrative, even though it was planned for the broad public. And after a few months in spring 2016, I also visited another exhibition, launched again in the same place, depot, and this exhibition was called Left Over, Left Behind. It focused on the forsaken elements of Armenians, like ruins, left behind craftsmanship, and people on the route of deportation after 100 years. The project team organized authentic and hand-drawn maps to certain topographies that were inhabited by Armenians prior to the extermination campaigns, and to alleged Armenian treasures, family trees, objects like church keys, and so on, that the team encountered during their field trips. And the exhibition also included photographs of properties and video interviews with survivors' descendants living in small Anatolian towns. It contextualized the present situation on the Armenian High Plateau and the past existence of Armenians, and how people remember, for instance, through the myths on hidden Armenian treasures. So that exhibition, Left Over, Left Behind, provided visitors with different initial points to bridge their biographical or collective experiences, like stories told in families, or geographical visualizations of deportations. And it contains pictures of recently built governmental social housings constructed near church ruins, and questioned the transformation of ruining, the memory and grave digging with the purpose of finding forsaken treasures. So the design and the objective of that exhibition was totally different than Bizzat Halledini's, even though both exhibition teams, the curator teams, were positioning for acknowledgement, for the recognition of the Armenian genocide. So we again see a kind of heterogeneous space, a heterogeneous community. While Leftover was using the term genocide, for instance, Bizzat Halledini's used tehcir, the deportations, in quotation marks. So these were also the differences.
So you get the opportunity to tell the story of this past, and you have these exhibitions that are organized. This first example, I think you mentioned, is almost like, well, here's how historians go about researching this past, and you have hundreds of documents that are made available, and maybe the hope is this preponderance of evidence is going to shatter the denialist narrative, right? You bring all these documents that show all the orders, the decision making that happened, that was behind the genocide. But I think your point is that in the end, you leave the visitor. The visitor has to kind of wade through all these documents, has to try to figure it out him or herself. It's a challenging way to try to understand this past.
Exactly. Because it was a kind of messy archive, and if you are not a historian or archivist who got that education, it was not so easy. Even for me, it was not so easy to get an orientation in the exhibition hall.
And I think you're mentioning that if you're relying so heavily on the archives, then you're reproducing the discourse of the state. And that's a discourse that talks about the genocide in terms of euphemisms, in terms of other expressions, right? Like the deportations. So you don't maybe take it on directly.
Yeah, that exhibition didn't take it on directly, yes. And the question is for me more like, so there is a position, the denialist position, that says it didn't happen. The Armenian Genocide didn't happen. So on the contrary, if you say, no, it did happen, look, these are the documents. So what is the next question for the public? What should be the next question that people would pose?
How did this happen?
Yeah. So an exhibition should give some room to the visitors. Give some room, provide some room, and say, okay, here are the facts, but how it has happened is here. You can read it, but if the visitor cannot connect to the own biography, so the question will arise, was it a good exhibition in terms of the aesthetics, in terms of the communication with the visitors?
Mm-hmm. Because I think this goes back to your point earlier that this genocide was only possible without participation of regular people on the ground, that it wasn't just decisions made by the government, orders issued, that it couldn't have, something of that scale couldn't have happened without widespread participation of regular, ordinary people. And this exhibition maybe casts it in terms of just the decision-making process without really giving visitors a sense of how regular people were implicated in this.
That as well. Well, in the exhibition, the visitors had the opportunity to read all these telegrams. But if you have 400 pages in a whole, it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a book. It's not a book. You have to stand and read.
So does Leftover then do a better job? Leftover is focused on what remains, the ruins, but also the people who may have had to convert to survive. So is it fair to say that that's a broader approach to that past? Does it give visitors a truer sense of that history? How would you?
I don't want to rank the exhibitions, but just the question would be whether we are talking about an exhibition or a book, So an exhibition has to have other objectives, or other purposes, other intentions, other approach than a book.
But at least it uses the label of the genocide, so you could say maybe it's more direct and more honest.
Yeah, but it was at least in quotation marks. The deportations in quotation marks.
Mm-hmm. But compared to the time where you were giving those tours, and you yourself really didn't have much to work with to explain those ruins, this Leftover exhibit really fills in a lot of the gaps that were left out of the official narrative, right? For people who had a chance to go, they could have a better understanding of what they were looking at and what was left behind.
Yes, and these interviews with the descendants of the survivors, the Leftover, Left Behind, they use the curators used both names, by the way, right? This is why I say now Leftover, Left Behind, but they started just with Leftover, and in their website they changed it afterwards. So in this exhibition, there were video interviews or interviews audio interviews with the descendants of the survivors. So the exhibition made it possible that people were the subjects who could also tell their stories. So in the other exhibition, I didn't have that impression that Armenians or Kurds or actors of the genocide they were not the subjects; they were more the objects. So we come also to the question of the agency. If an exhibition or a study recognizes the agency of the subjects. So in Leftover, that was I had the impression, and I also reconstructed my experiences in this ethnographic field research in these terms. So the people who were still there, the descendants of the survivors, were recognized and acknowledged as the subjects of this history that didn't end.
So Leftover or Left Behind doesn't really get at the how does it happen any better than the other exhibition.
It's a hard question. It's a hard question, and it's.
If it doesn't get at this issue of agency and how regular people carry this, you're just looking at what remains.
Yeah, what remains, but how regular people also deal with it. How they live in it, so to speak.
So the bulk of your study is on interviewing Kurds that still live in these areas, the area of Van. And was that driven by this desire to understand, well, how do people make sense of agency and the participation of their community in this past? How can you understand what agency means to people whose story is part of their family history?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I have to, in complete transparency, I grew up my own past. I have an Armenian past, and my grandparents died in the 1990s, but my grandmother was a survivor of the Armenian Genocide as a young girl. She came from Erzurum. And the stories that I heard were pretty cast the Kurds as perpetrators. And I always remember my grandmother saying, well, she came from an affluent family, and her father was killed, and they were marched out of their community, and her brother was dressed up as a girl to survive. And the Kurds were the ones who were robbing them along the way, kind of capitalizing on the situation. It was a very negative. And from reading your book, that seems to be a common narrative. Armenian narrative or remembering of that particular past and the role of the Kurds in that community. And I know your goal is not to tell the history of what happened, but when you're interviewing these people and they're delving into their own family histories, on the one hand, they seem to be much more open about recognizing what happened and labeling it as a genocide. But are there limits to how far they go in terms of their own memory work? I mean, what did you find? I mean, how did they remember that past? Was it a really skewed, self-serving type of memory, or an honest and open willingness to confront the past?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's an important question, and but to begin with, Kurds living in Turkey showed or have showed a proactive standing, positioning concerning the debates on the Armenian genocide in the recent years, like in the last 15 to 20 years. And that position includes a broad spectrum of activities, beginning with restoration of churches by the Kurdish governed municipalities, integrating like Armenian or Aramaic languages for public services, and so forth and so on, And of course, like the public declarations on recognition of the genocide. These also came from the Kurdish movement. You already mentioned that Kurds or the Kurdish movement were much more open or were much more progressive in these terms, in comparison to the Turkish government. And it's true. Yet again, Kurds in Turkey live under conditions of violence that, according to arguments made by the movement and by some scholars, occur in a quasi-linear continuum. So a continuity that is to be backdated to 1915. So, in general for Turkey, and of course genocide studies in particular for Kurds, there is this question of how should we discuss bystanders and the effects of this bystanding role on the era after the campaigns. So one of the ways of pointing at the bystanding, profiting, and of course witnessing role of the non-homogeneous Kurdish role is the instrumentalization thesis, which I encountered again and again, not just in the interviews that I conducted in Van and Istanbul, but also in my ethnographic research, in my field trips. According to this thesis, this argument, the Kurds were instrumentalized in the hands of Ottoman Turkish rulers, Kurdish power holders and landowners, to kill their neighbors, the Armenians. So they were played or lured into violence. Kurds, without considering any local circumstances and any power relations, had been deceived to practice violence and participate in massacres and plunders, according to this argument. So, in these terms, the thesis, this argument makes the Kurds non-actors. So this is why it's as problematic. So you mentioned your own family history. We also know from the studies and also from other oral history accounts that were recorded in United States and in France, and interviews with the Armenian survivors. So we know that Kurds were there; they were actors of the genocide. So the question is how to define that actorship. So if we say, okay, they were the instrumentalized ones, so it wipes out the actorship and takes the agency away. So this is why it homogenizes the Kurdish picture and, from my point of view, harms the Kurdish progressive standing too. It makes the Kurds victims of the genocidal events in the long run. And these instrumentalization theses overlook or even retune historical facts, and this is why it harms the progressive standing of the Kurdish people. If the argument is designed by through the instrumentalization thesis, the resistance in Van, and due to that, the agents of Armenians does not pop up. Or that the Armenians were also had also other actorships than being a victim. It also does not pop up. So the reorganization of the narrative occurs around the trajectory of the Kurdish history. The instrumentalization thesis is therefore not about the Armenian history; it's more about the Kurdish history, and this is my main argument. So, instrumentalization thesis is one of the elements that I found out, or that I discuss in my book. But there are also others, and my main argument is speaking about the Armenian genocide makes the experiences of the Kurds discussable and describable. So they remember the Armenian genocide. The Kurds remember the Armenian genocide as the beginning of the violence, of the state violence in the region.
Okay. So on the one hand, you can remember that past through this narrative you mentioned, this dominant narrative, the instrumentalization thesis, or how Kurds were manipulated, how religious beliefs were manipulated, how the state used leaders within the Kurdish community to carry out the genocide, and then you take agency away from regular people, that they were just they were used, they were exploited. Their leaders were the ones who were in charge, and you don't really have to take responsibility for what happened. That you were basically almost like just following orders. Beyond instrumentalization, it becomes a vehicle for talking about your own past. That if you're the victim, then it opens the door to talking about other experiences of victimization, which are real, right? That's part of what makes that area of Van so interesting, right? That there are layers of histories of violence that are part of that region. So you talk about the genocide, you can then talk about, well, what happened to your own community afterwards.
Exactly. Like I would like to give an example from an interview. I made an interview with with a guy who was in his mid 20s, Azim. I call him Azim. He mentions that the time after Armenians, in quotation marks, has worsened everything. And for the Kurds, it became much worse, he said. And I cite further now, I quote further, they made a pact with the state and later it was our turn. End of quote. So his argument pins it down that there was a mutual understanding, a pact between the state and Kurds as a generalized group, which ended up with Kurds suffering under violence operated by their allies of this bygone pact. In a later sequence of our talk, Azim says, I quote again, after they, the Armenians, were deported from Kurdistan became poorer and poorer because the jewelers in Midyat, carpenters in Diyarbakir, and so on, were all Armenians. End of quote. So the gone richness of this geography will haunt the Kurds, but not the Armenians. So it was like a kind of curse, no? In the absence of the Armenians, by the way. But the Kurds lost them, and now they have to live in their absence.
So maybe you could say you're almost doubly victimized, that you were manipulated into participating, been betrayed by those that manipulated you, and then victimized by having to live in this impoverished region afterwards that was a result of the genocide.
Yes, and that kind of argument, like the instrumentalization, what I call instrumentalization thesis, instrumentalization argument, it makes the bystanders naive victims, and that's problematic. On the other hand, it also works to remember the history, to remember the past, and contextualize what happened in the last 100 years, and through that it makes own experiences discussable and describable.
So on the one hand, you need to tell your story, and there were horrible things that did happen to the Kurdish community, massacres, right, that affected the Kurdish community. You mentioned in the 1930s. So you need to tell this past, but it's the way you do it also helps you to not really address what happened in your role in that earlier history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, like not just 1930s, but 1970s, 1990s, 1980s. The Kurdish people were repressed and oppressed by the Turkish state. So it's a kind of dilemma, maybe, or an oxymoron. On the one hand, it's that argument produces a kind of new history. On the other hand, it helps to talk about your own history or your own past. So it's a bit of oxymoron, maybe. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what's your sense, Eren? Now you mentioned that this period of openness, these exhibitions that you looked at, the commemorations that were happening during the 2000 teens, that no longer was possible. I mean, could you have a leftover exhibition today?
I'm not sure how to answer that question because I finished my field research in the year 2016. After 2016, like after I finished, or just before I finished my field research, there was a cube, or a tryout, so to speak, of a cube, and the state of emergency was declared in Turkey. So it changed lots of things. Like people, like Kurdish politicians, got arrested, and they are still in prison. Hundreds or thousands of Kurdish politicians, like on the local level as well, not just politicians who were in the parliament, the National Assembly, but also the local politicians got arrested and imprisoned. So, under these conditions, I'm not sure how to organize such an exhibition. I don't know.
But
and
the period of liberalization is over, right? It's fair to say, right, that made it possible to organize these exhibitions, that maybe made it possible for communities, you mentioned Kurdish communities, to take on restoration projects and organize commemorative events. That whole context, does that not really exist anymore in the way it did in the 2000 teens?
Yeah, the Kurdish mayors were also in prison, so they cannot do anything. So this is why we cannot evade any progressive attitude in the Kurdish towns, because the mayors who were elected, but who were also from the Kurdish movement, they got arrested.
So however skewed and limited maybe grassroots memory initiatives were, at least they were much more open stance towards taking on those histories of violence. And maybe that today is not, that openness is no longer there.
I really don't know the answer for this question, because I've been away of Turkey. I was in Turkey in these last years, of course, but not with that lens to run a study, to conduct a study. So I had another identity, like I was there to visit my friends and family. So,
but you think you mentioned even in terms of your own research, right? You had hoped to do a lot of interviews in the region of Van, and you had to scale that back, focus on Istanbul, that the context had become much more precarious.
Yes. It was the 2015 and 2016 when I conducted my field research trips to Van and Istanbul. And one of the reasons why I recorded interviews in Istanbul was because the war started again. So there was the war that was reignited after the June 2015 elections. So this is why I started first in Istanbul and then went to Van again. After now 8 years, and the social dynamics changed in Turkey so rapidly. I don't know. I really don't know their answer. I have to design a new research maybe and try, but I'm not sure.
I'm just searching for a conclusion. That's all. What kind of conclusion? Because there was openness, and you point out, all the limitations of that, and where are things at now? Because the state never really changed. It just adopted a different stance on denialism, right? But there was definitely movement from the ground up, right? And that's what's fascinating about Germany, right? Because it seems like the state, right, was very resistant, at least in West Germany, to acknowledging what happened during the war, and a lot of the recognition came from the ground up.
Yes, yeah. Well, I would suggest, like in case of Turkey, the NGOs or grassroots movements or like the political movements, they already discovered what they can do. So, I don't see any reason not to start it again. Why not? So there is this experience already. No? And what the civil society can achieve is really remarkable. Not just in case of Turkey, but also in other cases, like in Germany, as you mentioned. So there's this experience, there's this background, there's this toolbox, and we have lots of histories in Turkey regarding the violent pasts, regarding the atrocities. So why not?
Eren Yetkin is a sociologist at Koblenz University in Germany. He is the author of Violence and Genocide in Kurdish Memory, exploring the remembrance of the Armenian Genocide through life stories. Eren, thanks again for taking time for this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you for inviting me for this talk.
Next month, we'll hear from Jenny Wustenberg from Nottingham Trent University about her book, Civil Society and Memory in Post-War Germany. We'll learn about the activist who transformed the memory of the Nazi past in Germany and helped deepen German democracy in the process. If you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thanks again for listening to Realms of Memory.